the small town of Willow Hill, nestled at the foot of a dense forest, had always seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Its quiet streets and friendly neighbors had a charm that lured people in. But like many places that seemed ideal on the surface, Willow Hill had a hidden secret. A secret that hid in the shadows and crept into the minds of those who lived there. Sarah and David, a young couple with a 2-year-old daughter named Emily, moved to Willow Hill in search of a peaceful life. They bought a cozy cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by towering oaks and the tranquility of the forest. Their neighbors welcomed them warmly, but one in particular, an elderly woman named Agnes, seemed especially eager to make their acquaintance. Agnes lived in the oldest house on Willow Hill, a crooked, moss-covered structure that seemed as ancient as the forest itself. She would often visit Sarah and David, bringing gifts of freshly baked bread or jars of homemade jam. But there was something about her that made the couple uneasy. Her eyes held a sadness, and her voice was filled with sorrow, as if she carried the weight of the town's hidden secret with her. One evening, as the sun set behind the forest, casting long shadows over Willow Hill, Agnes knocked on their door. Sarah invited her in, and they sat around the crackling fire, sipping tea. "You're new here, aren't you?" Agnes asked, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Yes," Sarah replied. "We moved here a few months ago. It's such a lovely town." Agnes nodded slowly. "Lovely on the surface, yes. But there are things that lurk in the shadows of Willow Hill. Things you should be aware of." Sarah and David exchanged a puzzled glance. "What do you mean?" David asked. Agnes leaned in closer, her voice a hushed whisper. "The forest holds secrets, dark ones. There have been disappearances over the years. People who ventured too deep into the woods and never returned. It's as if the trees themselves swallow them whole." The couple exchanged another glance, this one tinged with unease. "That's just an old legend, right?" Sarah said, trying to dismiss the creeping feeling of dread. Agnes shook her head. "No, dear, it's real. And there are things in those woods that are best left undisturbed." As the weeks went by, Sarah and David couldn't shake Agnes's warning from their minds. Emily's nursery window faced the forest, and sometimes, in the dead of night, they would hear strange sounds emanating from the woods, whispers and eerie laughter that sent shivers down their spines. One moonless night, curiosity got the better of David. He decided to venture into the forest with a flashlight, determined to prove that Agnes's warnings were baseless. Sarah begged him not to go, but he brushed off her concerns and disappeared into the darkness. Hours passed, and Sarah's worry grew. She couldn't bear to stay inside any longer, so she grabbed a flashlight and set off to find David. The forest was dense and foreboding, and every step she took seemed to be swallowed by the thick undergrowth. She called out his name, but there was no reply, only the echoing of her own voice. Finally, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, she saw something that made her heart drop, a circle of trees with strange symbols carved into their bark. And at the center of the circle, David lay unconscious, surrounded by shadowy figures. Sarah rushed forward, screaming, and the figures scattered into the darkness. She knelt beside David, shaking him awake. His eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. "What happened?" he mumbled. "We need to leave," Sarah said urgently, helping him to his feet. "This place is not safe." They stumbled back to their cottage, and as they reached the safety of their home, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the forest. The shadows seemed to dance and whisper, as if mocking them. Days turned into weeks, and David's memory of that night remained fragmented and hazy. He couldn't recall what had happened in the forest, and Sarah was too afraid to press him for details. They decided to put the incident behind them and focus on their family, but the sense of unease never left them. They heard strange sounds in the night, and Emily's once peaceful sleep became fitful and restless. One evening, as Sarah was putting her to bed, Emily whispered something that chilled her to the bone. "The shadows talk to me, Mommy," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "They say Daddy's not Daddy anymore." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she kissed her daughter goodnight, but she couldn't deny the truth in Emily's words. David had changed since that night in the forest. He was distant, his eyes hollow and haunted. He would often disappear into the woods for hours on end, leaving Sarah and Emily alone and frightened. One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She followed David into the forest, determined to uncover the truth. She crept through the underbrush, keeping a safe distance as David entered a clearing similar to the one they had encountered before. There, in the center of the circle of trees, she saw the horrifying sight. David was no longer himself. He stood with the shadowy figures, his eyes dark and empty, his body swaying in a sinister dance. They chanted in a language she couldn't understand, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble with malevolent energy. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she watched, helpless and terrified. She knew she had to do something, but what? She couldn't confront them on her own. As if sensing her presence, David's eyes locked onto hers, and a chill ran down her spine. She turned and fled, racing back to the cottage to grab Emily. They needed to leave Willow Hill, leave the darkness that had consumed their lives. They packed a small bag and hurried outside, but as they reached the edge of the forest, they were met with an otherworldly sight. The shadows from the forest had come to life, stretching and contorting into monstrous forms. They blocked their path, and Sarah and Emily were trapped, surrounded by the very darkness they had tried to escape. David emerged from the woods, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. "It's too late, Sarah," he said in a voice that sent shivers down her spine. "You should never have come here." As the shadows closed in, Sarah clutched Emily tightly, whispering a prayer for their safety. Just when all hope seemed lost, a blinding light pierced the darkness. Agnes stood at the edge of the forest, holding a lantern that radiated a brilliant, pure light. The shadows recoiled from the light, hissing and retreating into the depths of the forest. David screamed in agony as he was pulled back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Agnes approached Sarah and Emily, her eyes filled with sadness but also determination. "You must leave this place, dear," she said. "The forest's hunger can never be satisfied. It feeds on the souls of those who dare to venture too close." With Agnes's guidance, Sarah and Emily made their way out of Willow Hill, leaving behind the town and its dark secret. As they drove away, they saw the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, banishing the lingering shadows. They never looked back, but the memory of that night in Willow Hill haunted their dreams. And as they left the town behind, they couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden in the darkness of the world, waiting to be uncovered.